If you were asked what the highest natural virtue is, that is, other than faith, hope, and love, do you think that you would know the right answer? Because for a long time, I would have said like justice or prudence until I later found out that according to church teaching, it's obedience. And I remember being more than a little surprised when I first read that for at least a couple of reasons. The first is that nobody had taught me that. Like most important details in the church, I had to read that for myself. You'd think that with the countless times I've been through RCIA, both as a candidate and as a sponsor, somebody would have mentioned, I don't know, like the highest virtue you can possess. The second reason is because I hadn't realized that obedience is a virtue. That may not seem that significant, but it's actually really startling when you think about it, because we tend to think of obedience as something we do only once the conditions are met. Like, you can't tell me what to do. Like, that's the first thing that appears on our lips when someone says something that we don't really like. That might as well be the epitaph on most people's gravestones. But a virtue is a stable disposition. It's something that is second nature once possessed. It should be our first instinct, and it becomes that way out of habitual routine practice. So for example, I like to go for long distance runs. My ability to lace up and go for a run is only possible because I habitually do it. If I wasn't in the habit of doing that, I couldn't do a 10K run. I could now physically do it because I possess the virtues that are necessary to be able to do that. If I took a few months off, which happens from time to time because winter is so violently inhospitable where I live, my ability to simply go back out and do it would be lost because I haven't nurtured the habit. A virtue, again, is something that you can only possess when it's practiced routinely. But how can obedience be said to be a virtue if we only exercise it once we run out of excuses or appeals to reasons not to obey? If it's a virtue, then this means that when some legitimate superior expresses some instruction or command, our first response should be to align our will and actions with that expression rather than grasping at reasons to escape that obligation. And by the way, the reason it's considered the highest virtue is based on an evaluation of what sacrifices are necessary to attain that virtue. So for example, to be generous, you have to sacrifice material wealth. To be temperate, you have to sacrifice certain physical pleasures. To be courageous, you have to sacrifice sometimes your sense of security. But in the case of obedience, we have to surrender that which is most deeply and personally our own, our very will, and which can only be given up voluntarily. It's the thing that God has entirely entrusted to us, but then asks us to return to Him in obedience. And our refusal to do so is at the heart of all sin. Disobedience caused the fall of humanity and the angels. And the world we live in today has this exactly backwards. We are told to admire rebelliousness and willfulness. At least we say we do. There was an ironic juxtaposition at a university not far from where I live, in which there were official platitude type slogan banners hanging outside from lampposts that said something like, be a disruptor. And this was caught photographically in the news at a scene in which a student protest was being shut down by the police. But even if we're inconsistent and slightly dishonest about it, these are still the slogans that the modern world promotes relentlessly, and it takes a lot of fortitude to push back against those popular currents. All of which is to say that obedience is a virtue that doesn't come very easily or naturally in the world that we live in. Now, this virtue does admit certain limitations, but we should be extremely cautious in invoking or grasping at these exceptions because aside from the relentless sneer from the secular world about obedience, this virtue is seriously under threat right now in the church. And sadly, not without good reason. Catholics have suffered under demonstrably and outrageously bad leadership in recent times and places. That's something I fully am willing to grant. But if every time a church leader steps up to the means of his instruction, our first instinct is to say, oh, what's he going to say now, right? Then I think we can be confident we've lost the habit of obedience. Because remember, it is a habit. If out of the last 10 pronouncements from the magisterium or some bishop you don't like, your and my first reaction, like 9 times out of 10, is to be skeptical and critical, then how can we say that we have the habit and the virtue of obedience? If the habit and the virtue is something you routinely do and it's your first instinct, then if the majority of time you're not doing it, then you can't make that claim. And don't get me wrong, I know this is hard when legitimate superiors are not doing their duty, but that doesn't mean we should sacrifice our own virtue just because they have. Okay, so what are the exceptions? Well, legitimate authority is only exercised insofar as it aligns with ultimate authority, which is God. Now, this doesn't mean that they have to sit in an office appointed by God, but that those who find themselves in positions of authority or governance only do so legitimately insofar as they do so under God's headship, whether they know they're doing that or not. So if they command something that is out of alignment with natural or supernatural law, then it's obviously out of alignment with God. And a startling portrayal of this fact is in Christ's own recognition of Pilate, the governor of Judea, of his authority. In their dialogue, Pilate says to him, "Don't you know that I have authority to put you to death?" And Jesus both acknowledges and rebukes his claim simultaneously in a stunning response. He says, "You would have no authority over me if it were not given to you from above." So he both admits that Pilate does have authority, but he defines the legitimacy of that authority by describing where it sits in a hierarchy of proximity to the ultimate authority. In other words, your authority is only legitimate insofar as it conforms to God's authority and will. To whatever degree you issue commands in contravention of his will, it's no authority at all. And then he says something even crazier. He says, "So go ahead and do what you're going to do." In other words, he issues a command to Pilate himself as if he's the one in authority here, and that whatever authority Pilate thinks he has is actually only coming from Jesus, who is above him and who is allowing this to take place. This is also why St. Thomas Aquinas can teach us that an unjust law is no law at all. It may look and sound and smell like a law, if laws have smells, but it isn't, and we only owe obedience to legitimate laws and authority. So legitimate authority depends on a hierarchy of authority that traces itself all the way up to God, and no lower authority can contradict a higher authority. So a priest can't contradict the legitimate commands of a bishop. The bishop can't contradict the pope, and the pope can't contradict God or revelation. If any of them do, they aren't exercising legitimate authority. The other limitation on obedience comes when authorities assume jurisdiction over something that is not theirs to govern. So for example, a parent has authority over their children, but once their children become grown adults and move away, those parents can't be calling them up in the evening and telling them what they should wear or what they should be eating. Now, as I've been reflecting on this question personally, my mind is drawn again to the fact that this virtue is under attack from all sides for Christians. The secular world wants to stamp it out and then eventually have it replaced with unquestioning obedience to secular authority. And bad leadership in the church has jeopardized the habit of obedience from within. But if it's going to be habitually practiced and therefore be sustained as a virtue, we have to find as many opportunities to exercise it as we can, even in these crazy times. And we have to retreat from occasions that habituate us to rebelliousness. And for this reason, I've decided to delete some of my past videos in which I spend considerable energy criticizing authorities in the church. And not necessarily because those criticisms aren't legitimate, but because there's way too much of that content on the internet right now. Like, if all we can find from orthodox voices about the church tend to be exclusively critical of authorities, then how will we ever practice the habit of obedience? If our minds are always drawn to outrageous abuses, then our will to obey, and therefore the virtue itself, will be constantly under threat. And so I'm doing this out of a desire to not want to contribute to that threat further, both for the good of the church and for each individual Christian doing their best to practice something that is already incredibly hard. And I know I'm going to be accused of like cowardice because there are legitimate instances of serious abuse in the church that are worthy of criticism. But believe me, from where I sit, this isn't an easy or a lazy decision that I'm making. Deleting content from your YouTube channel seriously harms it with the algorithm. It's actually a very real sacrifice for me to do, given how much I've invested in my channel. And so it's not something that I easily do. But as we've already discussed, the degree with which we're willing to sacrifice something in order to align ourselves with God, in order to possess some virtue, is a pretty good indication of its virtuous content. So here I am doing my best to practice what I preach. Can I ask you to stick around for one extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year. And if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.